All right, what's up? We are back with the Introduction to Web Dev quiz number 7, this time part B. So if you haven't seen part A yet, go check that out. Let's jump into this first question. Auto increment is only valid for numerical column types. A, true, B, false. Correct answer here is true. Yeah, so hopefully, if you know what auto increment, you could understand why we can only use these on numerical column types. An example here I've set up is where we've got this table. People, keep forgetting to label my tables for some reason. Anyway, and we have two columns, ID and name, and you'll notice here I set auto increment on the name, but like, what does that really mean, right? So here we have 3 entries in our table, Olga, Jerry, and Tom, but like, what is +1 of Tom, right? There's not really this sense of an increment to a column that's not numerical. If I had set ID to be auto increment like I did in the previous question, that would make sense, right? 3 + 1 is 4. So auto incrementing the ID column makes sense. But like auto increment, you should really only use on numerical columns for it to actually work within your table. And honestly, your database might even throw an error if you try to put auto increment on a non-numerical column. All right, next question. SQL injection is when A, we insert parameters into SQL statements, B, someone passes in a malicious SQL query instead of a parameter, or C, SQL statements are used in Node. The correct answer here is B. Yeah, so SQL injection is kind of like this hacker move that people can use when, let's say, for example, a client of your website has determined that you're using SQL somewhere within like a form, for example, and then they use it to their own benefit. So an example of this might be, let's say we have some sort of login, and let's say you already put in your username, and this time you're putting in your password, and let's say your code looks something like this, where you get the request string from this password input here. And you can see here the user of the website has put in a little malicious string, but we'll get to that real quick. So we've got this query. It says select star from users where password equals, and then what we've done is we've just sort of combined this string plus whatever the result of the password is. But here's where something tricky, something malicious happens. Some SQL injection. Oh no, horrible. So we would only want to get the rows that match the password, right? The user had just typed in password. What that means is we would only get this one row. But because the user has also put in this OR statement, or 1 = 1, which will always be true, what this means is they have access to all of the rows, because, I mean, that's true for this row and this row, right? So it doesn't even matter that this row's password does not equal password because we have that OR statement. And then they've done something malicious once again. They've put this double dash, which basically means comment out anything that goes after this. So in this example, it doesn't really do much, but let's say, for example, there was some sort of AND statement where it was like, and, user equals user, or something like that. This AND statement wouldn't even be registered because the hacker has commented that out. SQL injection is pretty scary, like you don't want all of your users' information to be accessed through SQL injection. So there's this concept of parameterizing your SQL where you're no longer doing like string interpolation, or string concatenation, that's the word, string concatenation. You say, I'm expecting a value, and you put like a question mark, and then the query is set up in a smarter way, such that the user can't do something like this anymore. This will no longer be read as SQL. We'll just say that this is the whole value. And then you want to actually find anything that matches inside the table. So always look out for SQL injection. All right, next question. The return type of db.exec is an array. True or false? The correct answer here is false. Yeah, db.exec actually doesn't return a value. So from the SQLite documentation, the promise actually has no result value. So you might want to use db.exec on statements where you're not actually selecting anything from your table. So let's say, for example, an update, an insert, a delete. Right, next question. We should always close our DB connections when we're done with them, such as at the end of our endpoint functions. True or false? The correct answer here is true. Yeah, so this is something you might forget at first when you're working within SQLite or just SQL in general. But we have to open up these database connections to access the data within them, but we have to also make sure to close them. The reason why is it makes sure that the associated resources are deallocated and that we don't consume all the memory available, which might cause the database to crash. And that would be really bad, right? So in this example, this code segment here, we're getting the rows using db.all in this query, which is like simple select query. Funnily enough, we're not actually doing anything with the rows. This is kind of dumb code, I guess. And then what we're doing is we're doing await db.close to make sure, we're not leaving that database connection open. We want to close it. All right, next question. A table needs to have a foreign key to another table in order for us to join them. A, true, B, false. The correct answer here is true. Yeah, so when we say that this, let's look at this example. So here, hopefully the foreign key between these two tables jumps out at you, but yes, it is the ID. So let's say, for example, within this customers table, our ID is our primary key, right? So remember, that means we can identify each row by its primary key and there are no duplicates of the primary key. And then let's say within this purchases table, the item number is the primary key. The way this relationship works is when we're setting up our purchases table, we would say the ID column is a foreign key to the primary key ID in the customers table. So we're connecting those two tables and we're saying if there is a value within the purchases with ID 1, that means there must be a customer with that ID as well. So yeah, it connects this way. We don't necessarily need to have, let's say for example, we had a fourth customer named Gary. We don't necessarily need to have that ID 4 within the ID column in our purchases, but the other way around, it does have to work that way. And so, as I mentioned, here we're making that customers table. We're saying the ID is the primary key. We're saying the item number is the primary key of the purchases. And then this is the golden juice, the golden sauce here. We're saying the foreign key ID, which is its own column, references, this should be customers, references customers ID, where that's a primary key. So yeah, foreign key, a column from table B that references a primary key or unique column in table A. So then, for example, if we have this SQL where we're saying select p.item number from purchase as p, where if you see the syntax, it's just kind of aliasing. So I didn't want to write out purchases.item number and customer.id. I set up an alias to make the SQL a little bit more simple. We're joining it on the customers table where we're saying that's C. We're joining it on those columns. We're joining it on the purchases ID and the customer's ID column. We're saying that if an ID exists in the purchase, it should exist in the customers. And we're saying where that customer's ID equals 1. So what we're saying is find me the item number where the customer ID is equal. So I would look over to the purchases table, and then I would look at the item number. It's 345, right? So this would be what gets returned. Well, not exactly the column name, but that value, 345, would be returned to me. So we wouldn't be able to have done this if we didn't have a foreign key referencing the primary key of the customers table. So going back to that original question, this is true. Yeah, you cannot join them if they do not have a foreign key relationship established. All right, that's the end of the Introduction to Web Dev quiz number 7. Hopefully you learned something. Always excited to hear what you learned. Have a great day.